Welcome, everyone. It's great to have you here for this webinar conversation with Derek Feldman about his new book, Social Movements for Good. My name is Rachel Hutchison, and I have the honor and pleasure of leading Blackbaud's corporate social responsibility. And I also am really pleased to say that Derek is someone who I've met and worked with for many years in the industry and really do consider an expert and a friend. So it's really great to be here with him today to talk about this book. Before we get started, I want to let you know that you can ask a question throughout this webinar, and we're going to take the last 10 minutes to actually take those questions. So if you look at the GoToWebinar box that you have, there's a little function there where you can pose a question. The other thing I want to tell you is that Derek is going to be giving away a free copy of his book after this webinar. And so if you tweet during this webinar, use the hashtag SMFGbook. Again, that's SMFGbook. And he's going to pull somebody from that and give them a free copy. So now to you, Derek. Derek is the CEO of Achieve Guidance. It's a great firm that does creative work for causes, both for-profit and nonprofit. And he's a real expert on social media, on millennials, and on social movements for good, which is the topic that we're here to talk about today. So welcome, Derek.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate the chance to talk about the book and this project, of course, as it's taken months to put together, but a fun time and a journey in itself.
Well, I don't know if anyone on the webinar today has actually read the whole book, but I've had the pleasure of doing so, and it really is good. It's very current. It offers a lot of great insights, and I learned a lot of things about just a lot of things that I didn't know, and particularly about when certain things in history happened, the roots of movements, and so I think it's really fascinating. So let's start with a really just basic question. So why did you decide to write this book?
Yeah, so at Achieve, if you haven't been familiar with the work that we've been doing from a research perspective, we lead the Millennial Impact Project in partnership with the Case Foundation. And that project has been looking at how millennials in particular have been focused on cause engagement and how they're activating. And so since we've been doing the research since 2009, I've sort of been in this mode of trying to understand, well, look at these movements that occur in the public, and whether it's an ALS thing or whether it's over here, not just millennials, but why are people doing what they're doing today with these movements? And so I had a chance to sit down and sort of reflect on what has worked and what hasn't over the course of the last 4 or 5 years in movement building. And I realized, well, whether you're a millennial or whether you're a boomer, or whether you're somebody else looking to engage in a discussion of bringing somebody from caring to really activating in a cause, that some of these behaviors are uniform. Some of them are historic, and there is no reason at times why some go viral versus others. And so I felt it was time to start talking about what happens when a movement today works, and what are the consequences or things that when they fail. And so that kind of led me to this inquisitive nature to say, I want to look at this from a different angle and understand the real behavior behind those that participate. And then in addition to it, I wanted to also make sure that we had a chance to really understand from those that create movements what they're doing too as well. So that's kind of helped us get there.
That's involved in the Millennial Impact Study, and it's great research. Is this book that you've just written on social movements for good about millennials specifically?
Yeah, somebody else asked me that too. I always get the, Derek, you're the millennial researcher, right? Well, we've been actually looking at all different types of cause behavior and cause research. It's not just that. And what we look at is, yes, there might be a large population of millennials who are participating in certain movements, but it isn't about them. What this book is really about is that if you're a cause or a leader of a company and you want to understand and build a movement in which you want people to belong to something and move to a different state where they not just believe in it, but they own it, that's for anybody. So it's the same constituent engagement process that we go through. And I think that's been a really big learning lesson, even for myself, as a person who set out to try and understand just millennials in particular. Is it just millennials? I mean, we'll talk about empathy later. I mean, boomers are empathetic, Xers are empathetic, millennials are empathetic. Once we get past those stages where we deeply care about a social issue, that doesn't necessarily change by demographic.
Well, as an Xer, I am very happy to hear that because I feel like I'm of the generation that always gets skipped over because it's just not interesting to anyone right now. Like the boomers are the ones with all the money, and the millennials are the ones that have this purchasing power and everyone talks about. So I think that's great. So is it fair to call this book a kind of how-to manual for people who are looking to begin movements or get involved in movements?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's probably twofold. One is that there's a lot of stories in there about leaders who have done movements, participated in movements. There's stories of movements that have failed and so on. And I think it definitely is a how-to. As much of it is helping the person who wants to drive social participation in their social issue to a new level. And
Okay.
I think that also means that there's a conceptual change that has to occur within the organization, that it isn't necessarily, I'm just going to start a movement and create that movement by doing a hashtag, that it goes way above and beyond that.
Yeah. So you did research specifically about social movements, right? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I did it from two sides. We looked at and interviewed the founders of those social movements and what was their thinking? What was the process that they went through to develop and devise them? And then we looked at how those movements actually played out and then talked to some participants as well to see, does this really all kind of match up? Are we in the same alignment? And it's interesting, in certain cases it did. A lot of it was there was a crucial time in which that the founders of these movements made some very interesting, sometimes strategic and some by chance decisions to let their movement go or expand. And it's because of those crucial decisions that they helped the people move away from just being a part of something to really owning it that was way beyond the founder in themselves. So I think that process really it comes out in the book where I interview founders and share their stories and what they learned themselves. And some of these are the most humble people where they had to sit back and say, this thing is much bigger than me will ever be in the equation.
hmm So I come from the perspective and the belief that good is for everyone. It's for individuals, nonprofits, companies, small businesses, et cetera. And as a CSR person at a company that provides technology that powers philanthropy, I'm really passionate about that idea that it's really not just cause action and good is not just coming out of the nonprofit world, it's coming out of all different segments of society. And you cover this in your book in a way. You cover companies as well. Is this why?
Yeah, to say that in order to do good, you have to just be an institution, a C3, I think is wrong today because we've got people that believe, and this is kind of the different perspective. Even if you're an executive director of an organization and you strongly believe that in order to do good, you have to do it through a C3, that might be your position. But let's reverse what the individual who's out in the general populace believes about doing good. In a time in which that cause and interest is at its most, nobody makes the decision in that moment to say, I can only do this with a C3. I want to do good and I want to express that part of being social good and participating in it through the products I buy and through the conversations I have, whether it be at my church or wherever it is. So we can't say into other people that your belief of doing good is not as strong as unless you did it with institutions. The other thing that happens is that this is really coming up from how we look at society and culture today, that not only can you do good through many different ways, that social issues are addressed by everyone, and it takes everyone to be participatory in it. And the stories that I share about New Belgium Brewery in particular, and in Fort Collins, who taxes themselves because of energy rates and things that are not happening locally, those are beliefs and social issues that that company has taken on to do good because that's the right thing they feel going
Hmm.
forward. It doesn't have to be done because just a nonprofit says it.
It's really funny that you pulled out that example because I think that one really struck me when I was reading the book. And I just feel even a better bond with that brand as a consumer, just having read that story. So let's move on to just understanding a little more about social movements themselves. So how do you define social movements for good specifically? Are they the same? This is something I get a lot, and I know the answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Are they the same as social networking, social media? What's a social movement?
Yeah, I think everybody probably desires that their cause and their issue reaches this movement status of where you have this mass population of people that have come together. Essentially, how I've defined it based upon looking across the gamut of all of these movements is that really these social movements court the interest. And that's really, really important to understand. It's the interest of the people whose lives are affected by the issue. It's not the interests of the organization. Now, social networking is a tool that bonds people together to support that interest, but the tool isn't the movement of itself. It's the collective power, honestly, of the people that come together, that collection of people that supersedes the organization's interest and will to just do something. The organization becomes the spark, the catalyst for the driving part of the movement. But the collective power of the people is what sustains that together. And I think that's
Hmm.
much different than just saying, well, we have a hashtag, and there were certain ones that I had covered in the appropriately titled in the chapter hashtag that talks about several movements that were created out of hashtags that the community got so far, but it couldn't go any further because the collective wasn't as strong together to move it out of the state of just general awareness and saying, yeah, that's an issue. I'm going to raise my hand in this moment to say I care about it. It didn't have some entity driving the people to constantly be underneath that. And I think that's the difference of what we see in just a social conversation versus a movement in of itself.
So collective power is obviously a characteristic of social movements for good. Are there other key characteristics?
Yeah, so we definitely have seen that there are stages of things and but the characteristics that we find is that these movements begin to form when the people feel as if they're owning it themselves. I'll talk later about the various stages that we started to see where individual participants and movements would go from a state of belonging, right? Just saying, "Hey, I like
Hmm.
this," and sharing something on Twitter to actually owning it. And one of the key features that I discovered as we were looking at all of these movements, the most successful and sustained movements were those in which that the people moved from a state of belief to ownership. And that doesn't happen all of the time. It is so easy to be a belonger. It's so much more difficult and challenging to be an owner of a movement in which that the people feel as if that's their piece in general to be a part of it and make it what they want. That's a key characteristic. The other key characteristics is that no individual in and of themselves was the movement per se. You know, it's kind of funny because some of the most successful organizations that created some of the most successful movements can a lot of people attribute it to those founders, but when you look at those founders, they established some infrastructure to allow the collective to occur, but they started to move to the background, of course, over that time, in that the individuals themselves were the representation of the beneficiary and of the issue, rather than the other way around. Now, it's interesting. Some would say, well, if you look at, we know that some of these are driven by the passion of an individual as a storyteller. That's true, but they haven't been sustained long term unless the people felt that ownership long term.
Well, so that really leads me to my next question around the phases, the four phases of social movements, and also specifically, how much of a social movement is orchestrated and how much of it is, viral or driven by that collective power?
Yeah, this is something that I started to understand as we were looking at movements in themselves, is that these organizations are typically the catalyst of movement drivers, right? You need the organization to, or something to help start it and get it going. And then at a certain point, it tips over to be away from just the entity being the supporting infrastructure mechanism over time. And so as you look at it, this is what we typically had seen in the research, is that they would start to build and gather groups of believers all together, right? So if you believed in, and I talk about HRC, Human Rights Campaign's work, if you believed in the LGBT issue, you started to formulate with one another. You belonged to it in some way. We're starting to gather the structure together. And then from there, the people started taking action with one another. And that action could be as simple as sharing or doing certain things. But then there's something else that happened in here, is that the movements that were just there by whether the organizations gathered them or let the people sort of take actions together, they just sort of would go in these cycles that they never would get out of true what we would define as movements going forward, where there was a ton of ownership. So in essence, it was being directed by the organization. And if the organization has to cue constant interaction with the people, where the people themselves are not rising up in that instance, we didn't necessarily move to that state. Now, of course, that's my sad face there, because that's essentially what happens, right? It's really good digital activism, and this is where everybody is in this state of is it slacktivism, right? I mean, Rachel, your work at Blackbaud and social media and social networks that we hear about, is true social change happening when we provide support through the form of awareness building, like hashtags and so on. And the answer is, well, it may not, but a lot of that's for the individual being a part of another group and taking action together, and they get that immediate feeling of satisfaction. But the pinnacle moment is when the organization says, now we have to move these people that take action together to begin to self-organize on their own, to begin to take our resources and brand and logo and own it for themselves. They are the ones that are embarking upon the conversations. We can fuel that, but we can't sustain it if it's just going to be us constantly. And I think that's been the sustaining part of the movements. Like HRC's movement has been very successful in that. Even in consumer movements like Patagonia's movements that I talk about in there, where they've been very successful with bringing environmentalists together, where they're starting to own it. And Patagonia is the impetus for creating some of that structure, but it's really moved beyond that. So these stages that you
Yeah.
see, from building and gathering to letting people take it over, taking action together, but shifting it away to the self-organizing and sustaining it. And then it becomes full circle, where the organization's creating this cycle consistently over years.
So, this is kind of baked into some of what you already talked about, but a key question that came to my mind when I was reading this part is how much serendipity is really involved? How much of it is just luck?
Yeah, I. It's funny, when I was doing the interviews, Rachel, with some of these founders, a couple of them of these movements are what they're trying to create. And we also interviewed, by the way, some newer founders that you would maybe characterize as not necessarily movement builders yet. And we wanted to get sort of a swath between both ends. And what's interesting is a couple of them, even your Scott Harrisons, would say, some of this felt like luck. It was just happened to be at the right time, at the right place. And even Scott Harrison's story that I share in there with Charity Water is, Charity Water was just supposed to be a one time about water. It's supposed to be about everything. It's supposed to be charity food and charity energy. I mean, you name it. That was the original plan for it all, and it never. The movement of Charity Water was just so sustaining that he didn't get to that part. Again, this is letting go of what he was trying to do, or it's yet to come. And so as we think about it, what I've noticed is in a lot of these founders is that a lot of them made decisions, but probably the hardest decision that they made was letting go with some of the stuff and letting the people own it, that transparent environment. But before that, they had, I would say, it crossed between being strategic with some luck in there, of course.
Yeah. And I don't know if at some point you want to talk about the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge, which was a really interesting social phenomenon. it wasn't started by the ALS Association. It was started by some really passionate people out there in the world, and then they got involved and helped to encourage it. But it almost happened to them at the beginning, which is really interesting. And that actually leads me to a question on technology, because the good news is that the ALS Association had technology in place, the online giving functionality and the infrastructure, so that their systems didn't break when they went from getting an average of $10,000 a day online to getting 11 million the next day, which is a huge leap. So how important is technology as a catalyst or as a tool in a social movement?
So important. But I think that we have to recognize its place in the movement building and process. A lot of people will come at it and say, in order to create a movement, you have to start technology first. And to be honest, this is where some of the challenges existed. I shared the story of the Bring Back Our Girls campaign. For some of you that are not familiar, that's the hashtag that had started, in which that Boko Haram in Africa had actually kidnapped some girls, and the campaign was to try and get them back, obviously. But what was challenging about that campaign is that on the ground there was no work that was actually being done. There was a lot of discourse and discussion and using of a hashtag. I mean, even the First Lady was out there with it. But in the end, it still is. I don't know if anybody's aware that there's still 70 out of the 100 that are still in captivity. We're not there yet. And so, and I mentioned this also in I had a chance to interview a lot of the international aid organizations. And one of the individuals that I interviewed had talked about that if you would have told us 5 years ago that we had to do all of our grassroots on the ground organizing, and we'd still be expending resources to make that happen, I would call you a liar, because that's not, we're in a state of just technology. And so we reconvened them, and we had done something with the Case Foundation at this too, where we convened everybody from Facebook and others to sit around the table and say, what are you still so surprised about in today's environment? And the fact is that we cannot decouple technology and hashtag activism and engagement or digital activism with on the ground work if we really want to affect social change. And so we need what essentially the best movement part, and I mentioned this in the Pinnacle Action piece, is you need on the ground work. And the Human Rights Campaign had done all of that on the ground work for a lot of time, building up coalitions and so forth.
Yeah.
Then the Supreme Court case comes in, and that was the moment to make it happen. They used digital activism even stronger than ever before. So if you're going to be a movement leader, you have to recognize you have to set up some years potentially or some work on the ground, getting it to a point where then you can use digital activism to tip it over to make change occur in that moment.
Versus thinking, and I know this happens in some nonprofit boardrooms, I've actually been in them myself, where someone will turn to someone else and say, well, we should use this Twitter thing and just start, and then we'll end up with like an ice bucket challenge like they did. Yeah. And it doesn't work that way.
No, so let's just take the ALS thing. An example is that is, and I know we're going to talk about this a little later when we get into belonging and believing and owning movements for the individual themselves. Is that when we look at the ALS in that piece, is that it had a lot of belongers. It was hard not to belong to it, right? So it had also tricked the algorithm to a certain extent with Facebook, because Facebook looks at video content uploads. It also looks at me, calling out, Rachel, will you go do this, right? Direct friend interact. I mean, there were so many things that made the algorithm so possible to make it successful. And when you looked at it, we had a lot of belonging to it. But belief in the mission is only something that's going to be a lot less. And so that is a movement that gets a lot of popularity, and it did raise a lot of money. I don't want to discredit that, but that money didn't necessarily mean that it came from a belief system either. And then lastly, I would say too, is that didn't actually come from ALS. That came from an individual who owned that, and then ALS was attached to it later on. Two separate things.
Well, so I know you're eager to talk about empathy. You mentioned it earlier, and it is really important. So why is this so important to understand in the context of social movements for good?
Yeah, I think this has gone, and this is something that I personally have struggled with over the years, is doing research and so on. It's like, how come? And I share a story of my wife and myself at a fundraising dinner, right? And all of a sudden, somebody gets over. I'm going to probably look like I'm not sensitive to the situation, but we're at this luncheon and our dinner, and as you probably who have all attended fundraising dinners, somebody very impactful gets up there and they speak, and and people are crying and everything, and my wife says to me and gives me the nudge, all right, go ahead and get out your money, it's time to give. And I'm saying to myself, Biz, come on, you don't know me, because I'm a little bit more sophisticated philanthropist than the average bear maybe, is that I'm sitting there saying to myself, oh my gosh, you don't know where that money's going, it's not a cause. I'm going through all the reasons not to give, where my wife's like, how can you not do this, right? She's crying with everybody else, so forth. And as we look at it, some of the movement building has a lot of the first early stages of belonging and being a part of this feeds into our human nature to be empathetic. We are empathetic people. We're human beings, right? So the moment that we move from a state of saying, wow, I want to participate because I see that person in need, it draws us in so emotionally. But the confusion that we get is those that participate in the belonging state, those that participate in a hashtag, are they doing it because they're empathetic towards that scenario in that moment, or are they doing it because they're a belief? And what happens with the individual is that they go through these stages of empathy where the person participates early on because they see an image, they see something that pulls on them. But it's the consistent and continual action going forward that drives them beyond the state of empathy to true belief in the movement. I think one of the best things that I heard, and this kind of goes to the Slacktivism piece and the digital activism thing that we were talking earlier. In the book, I had some conversations with Jim Cohn. He's a professor at University of Virginia that does a lot around empathy, and he shares a backpack story about giving two young girls, or two individuals, a chance to walk up a hill. And one of them has a backpack, and they were asked to do it on their own. And then the next time they're asked to do it with their friend. And the moment they did it with their friend, they felt more compelled to do it because they were with somebody else who could be together with that empathy, right? It's the feeling of belonging together and being a part of one another. That's important, as well as what's equally important to understand, and even from that discussion with Professor Cohn, is that our brains are really wired to do and be a part of the path of least resistance, right? So we all want to do good. We all want to express our feelings of being a participant and doing good. And when we share something, in that moment, our brain's like, how can I do that? Just do it quickly to feel good, but not necessarily yet at a stage where I need to go out and spend 3 hours in a car from downtown DC to get to Maryland or whatever it is to make sure that I'm doing that as well. So those are two kinds of things that are occurring.
Yeah. So you're really kind of saying that marketers and fundraisers really should appeal to the empathetic side of movements participants to get them to really internalize it.
Yeah, I think that we have to start with empathy, then move the population out and move them beyond just being empathetic as well. So if we stay in states of empathy all of the time, you're just going to get an impulsive reaction, not necessarily long-term belief change that is desired.
So you talk about belonging, and this is a really important part of the book, I think. You talk about the nuance between belonging to a movement and being the movement. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier around the ALS piece, right? So we had seen and we had talked with individuals, and as you look through there, I noticed that somebody had said, Rachel, we got a little bit of background noise, so I apologize. Hopefully we can correct that for you. But as we were looking at the belonging and believing stages, we saw these so many people really start in a case where it felt good to belong to something, primarily because there was another individual. Could have been a friend, it could have been leverage, it could have been just really good at that moment that they walked across the street and said, how can I not participate? But there's a lot of belonging, we got a sense, in a lot of the cause work that's occurring, cause engagement. Not that it's wrong at all, and that, again, feeds that internal, but it doesn't bring the person to the belief stage, like, this is the issue I deeply am passionate about. This is the work, as you know, Rachel, fundraisers and marketers try to do, is they try to move people from stages of caring, right, or stages of interest even higher. And as we noticed, even in the ALS case, it was hard not to belong to that, right? How could you not? A friend calls you out through a social network. There was video, and it was all in due fun, and all for a good cause in the end. But was the cause the impetus of it, or was it because it was important to belong? And that's where we started to see it. When we start to see people like, and I talk about Liberty in North Korea, and I shared their stuff in years past, is that their constituent model is, we do want you to belong to this movement of refugee pieces that they're working on through North Korea, but we also want you to own it. And the only way you own it is if you internalize it and you continue that over time. And as you'll see, they have, what some would call probably the best raging constituents and fans that are out there, because they take communication to help the individual move from it just being a participant in raising a dollar to spreading it and owning the word and expressing that word how they feel is important, not how the organization thinks is important. And then helping that individual go to the next step each and every time to create an event, create an action that's not important to the organization, but that's important to them. That's the difference between marketing and fundraising for an organization and marketing and fundraising for a movement, in which that everything is in line with, you should do this because you think, or you are a part of this and it's important to you.
So is that what you mean when you say in the book about the idea of social movements being inclusive versus exclusive?
Absolutely, absolutely. Because honestly, if we want this, if we want the movement to drive, there's that pinnacle moment, right? So it can be exclusive, just, hey, share our hashtag or share our other thing. Because if you think, even in the HRC case, Love Wins was not necessarily theirs in the beginning, although it was used a lot. It was used by the population in that moment. That's what we see the drivers of movement. If we are only focused on exclusive opportunities for who we are and being a part of a space in which that we're clearly defined in our niche and nobody else is a part of us, you're going to get some belongers. You have some believers and some owners, but you're going to be a lot in the belonging phase. And until you allow and remove that state, or that sort of wall between you and the individual, and shift the mentality away from that, you're doing this for us, but rather you own it and you take the destiny with your own issue through us.
So supporting a cause is not the same thing as being a part of a movement, right? Because you can support a cause without that feeling of ownership.
Yeah, I joke in the book about, we have a lot at times thoughtless giving that occurs, right? You and I, nobody planned out in the year that ALS came out. They didn't say at the beginning of the year, listen, I am going to plan that there's going to be this movement or this thing called ALS, and I'm going to do this. But it later happened. It was impulsive at times and so forth. When we were in the grocery store lane and the cashier comes up to me and says, "Derek, will you donate $1?" That's a thoughtless, impulsive piece that feeds into the empathy of saying, I want to be supportive. I want to be a belonger in that moment. That not necessarily believe in it. So we have a lot of that, even through our studies with millennials or other individuals, is that a lot of giving is sometimes leveraged and introduced through third parties and all this stuff. We can't confuse what we see on paper, that we have 500 donors and they give at this level, with those 500 people truly believe in the mission. I mean, if the organization went away, how many of the 500 would be honestly, authentically upset that you no longer exist to address that issue? That's the driving impetus for all of this movement stuff that we're talking about. If you went away, how many would really put up a fight for you to stay in business? And that honestly is where we have the difference between being a belonger and an owner.
So in the Millennial Impact Study, you talk about, in last year's results, the importance of millennial engagement in groups, getting people, millennials want to go out and volunteer in groups. And in this book, you talk about, you share some stories from Adam Braun, and he has apparently said that the future is social engagement in small groups. Do you agree with this?
Completely. I think we're at a stage that both the tools, digital tools, as well as our way that we do social movement engagement or cause engagement is at a phase where that the populace and the people together are allowing them to own the issue. And it feeds on our empathy, it feeds in the digital piece, and it allows these groups of people to own it so much better. And it feels better when you can own it with a friend that deeply cares just like you do as well. That's that, right? That's that collective power. Now the thing, this is where the organization really needs to be, really have their constituent and movement participation really high, is that collective power has to move in these stages, right? We move from collectively being a part of this to belonging and then believing and then owning. We need the organization to help support that infrastructure, but it doesn't mean that we need the organization to direct it. That's a different mentality and an older mentality of social movement building that we had seen in past years where the organization had to drive so much of it.
All right, so we've talked about belonging. I want to switch the conversation to believing.
Yep.
So what does it mean to believe in a social movement?
Yeah, so when we had a chance to sit down or even look at Liberty North Korea's stuff, when you talk to constituents, I always like the and you've been on boards too, Rachel, where you say to somebody, why are you on that board, or why are you participating in it? And what we would find is that truly those that believe would always start with a belief statement. It would be, well, I believe that, and then it would be mission related. And when you find that you have a belief or the belief statement, people start with those. They're truly understanding that what's imperative is their involvement in that issue, and that they believe in it more than it's about the organization. So we did find in our encounter over time, not only through this, but other studies, that those that start out by saying, I'm a part of it because it's got great people, or it's a really cool way that they marketed it, all those are just those are really superficial at them. I mean, there's a lot of great people that work at a lot of different organizations over the course of many nonprofits that I know about. It isn't just, I wouldn't qualify one versus the other. It really was about themselves. And that belief statement is something that drives them. So you believe in this. Why is this so important to you? Why are you doing this? And it was a very interesting one, because when you do qualitative interviews on those that belong, the belongers would go into, it was really great, my friends are a part of it. It would always be external related. It's never internalized. Versus the folks that would be in the believing state would say, yeah, I believe that we should have this, and therefore I support it this way. They started that way, and I think that's where we got to get to.
So I know you just did a great blog post for Black Blood Today that's on our NP Engage site about creative tips around social movements. And how much do symbols matter, whether it's a graphical symbol, an image, or even a person? How much does that symbol matter to a movement?
Yeah, I have a whole chapter on symbols and movements that we found, and it was interesting to look at some of the symbols. Let's since we had a couple examples on HRC, I'll continue that. If you recall, remember they were working on the ground already. The symbol of the equal sign had been in existence already before this had happened. But what they wanted to do was seize the moment, right? Seize the moment of what was happening with the court case and everything else. So they changed the color of their symbol, the red. I don't know if you recall that. A lot of people had done that. So change that. In that moment, that small tweak made it so imperative that symbol, that in of itself, was a part of belonging to that issue and being a part of it. I mean, the bucket, to a certain extent, was the symbol for that belonging movement of ALS in and of itself. So symbols, what they do is that they band the collective power together. But a symbol is only supportive when the whole thing, the whole movement is there that needs that. And small tweaks and changes to symbols can mean a lot of different things. I mean, for instance, I also talk about the autism symbol, the puzzle piece. It's not just an autism speaks symbol. That's a symbol for the autism community as well. So that symbol of a puzzle piece, that history before Autism Speaks had it, per se, or using it in some of their branding. And that's the kind of movement driver where the people own it. And there's a theory, or there's a reason why the puzzle piece is in existence.
Mm-hmm. So do you want to talk a little bit about owning, or do you want to skip on to what makes a social movement successful versus unsuccessful?
Yeah, I think it's probably good. It's an interest of time to talk about things that failed and also worked, and some of that. Because I know
Well, you know, the key question is like, why do certain social movements succeed? Why do certain ones fail? And I'm kind of interested in the idea of, how do you know that they've failed? How do you even gauge that? Or how do you know that they've succeeded? What's the metric you use?
Yeah, that was really funny because in doing all of the interviews and all the other pieces, you have to determine, well, what's not a social movement? Because I'm sure that we have some people who are listening right now that would say, well, are you is it just trivial action? Is it not worthy of anything for somebody to do digital activism or any of this stuff until their belief state? And the answer is no. You know, I think that as you look at movement building, and as I explain in the book, a lot of those actions are for somebody themselves to feel good and to help that, and that helps spark that do good sense that we all hear about. And so you need that. You need that kind of going forward. I think one thing that's kind of interesting in the failures that I note in there is that those that constantly stayed in the organizational mode and didn't allow the individual to feel like they were the powerful part of it constantly had trouble maintaining or sustaining anything long term or even in a short blip. A lot of the very successful organizations elevated the power of the individual above anything else, above the celebrity, above this, above that. And that the messaging part of it was, you, Derek, you are imperative to this. Without you, we can't make this possible. So they were really successful in heightening the perception of the individual that without their involvement, the movement in of itself wouldn't carry on or wouldn't go, which directly hit the, oh my gosh, I believe in this, so then I need to participate. The other thing that made very successful movements is when they could talk about shared beliefs, which is really, really crucial. So if you see some of the creative that I talk about in the book that was successful, some of them will start out with some belief statements that will say, we, like you, believe that this is important. So automatically driving the belief and ownership of the collective was much more far successful than the organizations that try to create digital, kitschy type style hashtag activism that had a short blip on the social media spectrum for a day or two, but didn't do anything after. The other thing is that when we saw the movements that were the most successful, is they detached from an individual. The individual. So this is where, I always like it. Somebody asked me in an interview, Derek, do we need a celebrity to help start the movement? I said, you could use a celebrity to help start it, but they can't maintain. It moves beyond them. It's great to see that a talented person who might be a celebrity and has a personal passion and a belief for it, but they're not that doesn't mean that I'm owning it because of that. So there's a lot of the ones that had failed had used icons and different types of celebrities or talent to help them short term, but long term it really fizzled, and it really didn't get the movement that I was trying to. And I'd say the last key thing that I started to notice in the analysis, that those that had failed, those that had not necessarily been as successful of those that had been successful, they didn't determine what social change they were trying to create. What they were trying to do was generate awareness rather than true change in their mind and their vision, right? So it would be the reason that, like, we need to do this because we believe in it. Then we're going to create the mechanisms to get people to the state of belief, versus saying, what can we do to create a lot of awareness so we can raise money? That was a short-term sighted piece that fizzled very quickly. There was no sustained message or context that they could build from. So it was flipping the theory of change around in a way.
Yeah. So kind of the last category of questions I want to ask you about is about leaders of social movements before we go to questions from our online audience. So you interviewed a bunch of social movement leaders for this book. What surprised you about the time you spent with them?
Fairly humble. Almost all of them were. I asked every social movement builder at the end of my time with them. I said, "What do you want people to remember you? After obviously, in years from now, what do you want most people to remember you by?" And you would think, right? Some of these were some of the most successful movements we had. You'd think maybe it was that I led this or I did this, and a lot of them were very, very intellectually, I would say, thought-provoking in a way that they would end it with, "I just want to be known that I helped do something for this issue that was so important, and I somehow helped a few people, but most importantly, that I was the best person I could be to my family and my friends, and a much more humble personal experience than ever before." And I think the other thing is that as we see the drive for social entrepreneurs or just anybody who's creating something, right? In all of these leaders who you would say externally, you probably look at them and they've probably been speaking at conferences and you've heard their stories in a different way. You would say they are very successful, but to them, there's still a part of what they envisioned. There's still a little bit of I'm still not done. It's not truly realized yet. And I think that's the driving passion that these people bring around them too as well. And then I think one other thing that was very, very interesting and eye-opening is that a lot of these the causes and the movements that are covered, almost all of them started out with nothing, really nothing. They were ideas on issues. They were about bringing people together. Not a lot of them started with a foundation dollar of $1 million, or, $1 million grant or something else to get them going. It was really, there was a group of people that came together and said, "This isn't right," or "This is what we got to have and what we got to fight for." And I'm going to start, and it might be a little bit smart in the creative side, or it might be a little bit smarter with some relationships, but we don't have anything right now, and we got to bring people around. I think there's a myth, or some people believe that in order today to create movements, you have to have resources, start them. And that's the greatest thing that gives us hope and opportunity in today's age, that we do have tools that can help start it. But you don't necessarily need to have that in the early stages.
Yeah, well, so there is a lot of commonality. You talked about, being humble, about starting from nothing. Are there other things that you found in common among this group of leaders?
Yeah, a lot of them have very strong family ties and relationships internally, and I had, even early on as they were entrepreneurs themselves and starting these ventures, these adventures as well as ventures in themselves, a lot of them figured out along the way that it was more detrimental not to do something than to do something. Like the case with Kim Jordan and New Belgium Brewery. She's like, "How can we stand here as a company and not do this?" And so so through their own process of, this can't be right, and I can't just go to the office and let that go, that I have to, it's imperative that I start to bring people around it. So that drive to not to do something outweighed the drive to say, well, somebody else will take it up.
Mm-hmm. So some concluding questions. We've got nonprofit marketers and fundraisers on the phone. What should they do right away if they're interested in getting involved in social movement building?
The one thing you should do is, I want you to print out everything that you have ever done externally and put it on a conference room table and circle how many times you say "we," or and all talk about yourselves. Movement building isn't about you. It's about people that come together and they happen to work through you to be successful as a collective together. If you think that starting this because you need more attention is imperative, this place isn't for you. And understanding how you position yourself against other populations to bring them together is really, really crucial. That's step number one. Step number two is sit down and honestly have a discussion as a staff and constituents together and ask them what they truly believe and see if that aligns with what you're working on. If it doesn't, then you also realize that you need to spend more time building the collective together and helping them move from a state of belonging to what you're doing to really believing. And then lastly, for fundraisers in particular who might be joining here, is we're at a state today where people want to be a part of causes and issues because they want to own it and they want to get a feeling. They want to have a feeling that no matter what I do, that it's going to move something more than anything else. And the greatest thing that I learned with the social movement builders and leaders that I'd interviewed and been a part with, almost all of them treated the $20 like they were 20 million. And they figured out through digital as well as through non-digital ways that your action and a part of the collective is as imperative as anybody else. And it was so resonating with those that had actually been a part of them for over time to make them feel so special. Makes them feel to want to be a part of it.
Well, I have a couple more questions I'd love to ask you, but I do want to invite anybody who is on this call to pose a question through the tool that you have here with GoToWebinar. So please do feel free to pose those questions, and then I'll ask them of Derek. And while we wait to see if any questions come in, I want to ask you, Derek, is your advice different if someone on the line is from a company or from a small business?
Yeah, I love, the embodiment of some of the brands that we saw with some of the consumers that were part of in looking through these social movements is very interesting. The passion and the drive for some of Patagonia's consumers. Even I mentioned, I had an article today about Cotopaxi, who's a company out there that embodies this too, and others, is that their consumers have moved beyond consumption of the good to belief in what the brand stands for. And so if you're a small business or you're a company, what is it that you stand for and believe in so that your consumers can be there with you? And Patagonia and others have been very successful at saying, we believe, we're putting the stake in the ground that the environment can't be like this. And we're willing to do what we can to bring our employees, to bring our people and do this through products, but product alone doesn't mean that you have to be a part of our movement. That they created movements not just for their consumers, but for people that were part of their community and how loosely they defined it. And so I hope that as a small business or companies, you define for yourself what is it that we believe in, and how are we going to ensure that through our products, through our services, through our interactions with the public, that belief system comes out so that people can be a part of that collective we're creating.
So I have a question from someone in our online audience asking about how you scale social movements globally, where the nuances of local context may be different from country to country. Is this something that you looked at?
Yeah, there was a whole section about international, and it comes out of some challenges. I think, Rachel, you mentioned earlier about what are some things that have failed. There's the one thing that we noticed in a failure that we had a lot of is some organizations who were really focused on showcasing the inequality that exists, right? So here's a couch, or here's what your water looks like today, and here's what somebody whose water is over there. And a part of that is the shaming mentality, right, of global environments because of inequality. And we were interviewing some people, and as you look at some of the most successful ones that have been out there, is the opportunity to, which is so important. And as we look at that opportunity, it's one of those to say, how do we, from a global perspective, share the opportunity with people to help others no matter where you are? And the nice thing about social movements and scaling is you can scale beliefs. You can't scale just what your organization does in that moment for just one there. So if your organization is about a belief that resonates globally, and that is something that's easy to scale, or not easy, but better to scale than just saying, do this for us, because we're better at doing this for one small segment of the population. And the most successful international NGOs that had movements that were part of them, they shared the belief statements and they also shared opportunities. And that's what had helped not only garner attention, maybe through digital, but also on the ground in communities. Those were two things that people gravitated towards versus saying, well, fund our water program versus fund somebody else's water program.
So I've just gotten one more question. We only have 5 minutes left, so I want to ask this before I ask you a closing question. Can you talk about the skepticism around large organizations from younger audiences?
This is a very interesting. I'm actually performing this webinar right now from the offices of the Case Foundation, and we were having some good-spirited discussions around institutions and trust and all of this stuff. And here is where we kind of net out with certain things. Is that institutions over time, right? If you look at how the nonprofit sector formed, right? A group of people, a collective got together, formulated a group of other people that cared about that issue and so on, and then moved those people to care, and then we had to formalize things. One challenge is that we've done in the formalization, and this is personal based upon this, what we've looked at, is that a bad outcome that has essentially come out is that the institution has rose against the collective power of the people that care about it. But yet the institution is representative of it. Young people today believe in issues and they believe that they have belief systems, and organizations represent those. But what organizations are trying to do is attach them to the institution in and of itself rather than to the belief system that they share with young people. No young person doesn't believe in what you do per se. It's that they don't believe necessarily that they need to attach to your C3 and to your board and to that manner in which that you've historically over the last 20 to 30 years have felt was so imperative. So I am very optimistic about the opportunity that exists because young people believe, just like all generations, that social issue and change needs to occur. And institutions do too. It's how it's being presented today, which worries me.
So I do want to thank you for being here this last hour and talking about this great book with me, and thank everybody who's been online with us. I do want to remind everyone that Derek is very generously going to be giving away a book to people using the hashtag, and I have taken a look at Twitter, and there are definitely a lot of people out there who've done that. So as we close, Derek, I want to ask you this one final question. Any final words of wisdom or advice about social movements for good before everyone goes off to buy your book?
Fundraisers, marketers, CSR execs, what you're doing, and anybody who wants to be in this field of doing good, is presenting an opportunity to people to act on their beliefs. Don't forget that. Once you help people understand that part of your work, it's so impactful. Don't get into I want to create the digital activism hashtag of the century today. That's not going to help you. What's going to help you is how you help present to others that believe just like you that there's an opportunity to make something different. Stay in that mentality and you'll be far more successful in what we've seen than those that haven't.
With that, I want to thank everyone online for joining us. I know this has been a fascinating hour for me. I hope it has been for you too. And thank you, Derek, for sharing all of your wisdom with us.
Well, Rachel, thank you, and thanks for all of your support, and Blackbaud and others for being a part of today. And I really appreciate the chance to talk to everybody about this. And we're going to continue the conversations in many different forms. There's a book tour out there, so I'll be throughout the country talking at different stops and locations. So looking forward to that too. I appreciate, as somebody, as I wrote in the book, I get an opportunity too to share what we've learned. And so I'm only thankful to those that are willing to listen and be a part of it. So thank you. Thank you so much. And I think, Rachel, I think that's it for today.
Great. Yes. All right. Thanks so much, everyone.
Bye-bye.